Back in 1867, there was plenty going on. In November, for instance, Marie Sklodowska-Curie was born, a legendary scientist who explored radiation and discovered a few elements. Before that, in May, the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg got officially recognized as an independent country. And before all that, on March 30th, a big historic transaction happened. The Russian Empire sold Alaska to the U.S. for $7.2 million in gold. Today, this deal seems like a big win for the U.S. since a huge piece of land packed with natural resources was given away for next to nothing. But that's now. And back in the day, the purchase of Alaska seemed questionable, caused a stir, drew serious criticism. And let's face it, people are still talking about and debating it even now. We'll dive into it today too. But first, coffee. Just an unobtrusive reminder to those who forget to hit the like button at the end of the video, don't forget to do it. And thanks to everyone who gets my wish to stay anonymous. Many people know that Alaska used to be a part of the Russian Empire, but for some reason it's way less common to hear that Eurasia and North America were originally connected. Yes, it's true. Back then there was no Bering Strait, but instead the Bering Land Bridge, or Beringia, which is thought to be the crossing point for some of the earliest settlers of North America. Scientists are pretty sure that the latest findings, beyond a reasonable doubt, prove the Bering Land Bridge first appeared about 35,700 years ago. At times, the bridge looked like the tundra of northern Alaska and was home to large mammals. But that wasn't always the case. Often the bridge was locked up in impassable ice, except for short periods between 24,500 and 22,000 years ago, and between 16,400 and 14,800 years ago. Evidence from archaeology and genetics supports the notion that early humans could have made their way across a land bridge roughly 14,000 years ago in one of those periods. Back then, sea levels were way lower, and hundreds of miles of coastline were exposed along Siberia, Alaska, and other parts of North America. These days, all the coastal areas early humans might have used on their journey south are buried under water and sediment. Still, scientists have gathered enough evidence to show that people reached North America by this very route. Genetic studies suggest the first arrivals came from an ancestral group of ancient northern Siberians and East Asians who mingled about 20 to 23,000 years ago. Of course, this is just one of the existing theories, and I won't get into the details or discuss the others, since this video isn't really about that. But one thing scientists do agree on, people really did make their way into North America from Asia. It took thousands of years before new folks showed up here, this time Europeans. But that was a whole different kind of settling. In the mid-18th century, as British colonists began to gradually take control of the east coast of North America, the faraway northwest coast of the continent was claimed by the Russian Empire. Since the victory in the Great Northern War of 1721 made it the dominant military power in Europe, the country officially started being called an empire. And the empire needed to expand its presence in the world. Emperor Peter the Great and his successors quickly realized that to do this, they needed to look east, to the Pacific Ocean and beyond, to the Aleutian Islands and the coast of Alaska. It wasn't just a chance to take more land, but also an opportunity to maintain control over the profitable fur trade. At the height of his reign during Peter the Great's lifetime, fur trading accounted for more than 10% of the empire's total income. Russian explorers and hunters had known about the potential riches lying to the east since the mid-1500s. But it wasn't until 1725 that the Danish cartographer and navigator Vitus Bering, commissioned by the Russian crown, set out to explore the lands along the northern Pacific coast. It was Bering who showed that Siberia stretched much further east than people thought. He also proved that it was possible to navigate through Arctic waters to the north of Russia and reach the Pacific Ocean. Bering spent long, meticulous hours mapping the Aleutian Islands and the coast of Alaska, and this was the essential first step toward taking over and colonizing the land. By the way, according to the explorer himself, the area was huge, and the weather, awful. Although Bering wasn't the first subject of the Russian Empire to reach Alaska, it was his expeditions that are considered decisive. He proved that it was possible to establish trading posts and settlements on the new land, and that only a narrow strait separated the Siberian and Alaskan land masses. However, although the straits were named after Bering, he didn't live to see that event, The explorer died of scurvy in 1741. So what do we have? Europeans discovered Alaska in 1741 when a Russian expedition led by a Danish explorer, Vitus Bering, found its mainland part. The icy, foggy, stormy weather of the northern Pacific Ocean didn't stop Russian traders in the fur business from funding voyages to Alaska. After all, what else could they do once the high demand had wiped out the sea otters and other fur species in Siberia? In the end, more than 40 traders sponsored new expeditions between 1740 and 1800. And hunters came back with rich hauls. These successful expeditions only fueled the Russian Empire's interest in setting up bases in Alaska. They were needed both to assert territorial claims and to support fur trading expeditions. A well-known Siberian merchant and fur trader named Grigory Shelikov eventually established Russia's first permanent settlement in Alaska, Three Saints Bay on Kodiak Island. This happened in 1784. He lived in the settlement for 2 years with his wife. Besides the couple, another 200 men settled in the bay. From here, explorers traveled further inland into Alaska and established new settlements. Today, the spot where the Three Saints Bay once stood is uninhabited, but it's listed in the National Register of Historic Places and holds the status of a National Historic Landmark. By the way, archaeological digs showed that earlier, around 100 BCE, Native American tribes lived in this very spot. The relationship between Russian colonizers and the indigenous people was always shaky. While the local communities traded with Russian merchants, they fiercely resisted any invasion of their land. Native Tlingit warriors wiped out a few Russian outposts in 1802, but the colonizers regained control 2 years later. From then on, the Russian Empire's mission in Alaska grew. They even brought serfs from the mainland to set up farms in Yakutat, build forts, open sawmills and tanneries. They even went as far as mining coal and iron ore deposits. Here's what the map of Russian settlements looked like back then. And while it all sounds like a story of successful colonization, in reality, the Russian community in Alaska struggled desperately to survive. The conditions were awful. Food shortages were a serious issue as the Alaskan settlers were almost entirely dependent on supplies from Siberia. Sometimes the goods arrived spoiled, and often they didn't show up at all. By 1806, the colonies had basically found themselves on the brink of starvation. With that in mind, expeditions set off southward looking for food and a chance to expand their reach, eventually making their way to California, where they set up another Russian colony. But that's another story. For now, let's focus in Alaska. No expansion deeper into the mainland could save the Russian settlement. Partly it was because overhunting had already taken a toll on the sea otter population by the time it was founded, and it was sea otters that people went there for. The profits from the fur trade started dropping, and on top of that, other colonial powers began looking suspiciously at the Russian Empire's expansion. In short, the emperor had to rethink the colony's prospects. So in 1862, he decided not to renew the mandate of the Russian-American Company, and a few years later, the lands in Alaska were sold to the United States. The deal amounted to $7.2 million. We tried to convert this amount into modern money, taking inflation into account. We used a few converters. These calculations aren't simple, but it looks like today that sum would be about $153 million. Wikipedia provides slightly different numbers. In 2023, the old $7.2 million were equivalent to $129 million. Clearly, the prices were completely different back then, so don't think Alaska was sold for the price of a sports car. When the agreement was signed, President Johnson appointed General Lovell H. Rousseau to help with the handover of power. The general arrived in Alaska on October 18th. Later that same day, the Russian flag was lowered and the American flag was raised. Both Russian and American troops were present at the ceremony, along with a few leaders of the native tribes. All interactions between the Russians and Americans were of the friendliest character. Most Russians who lived in Alaska didn't live there permanently, so they just returned to the empire after the land was sold. But there were those who wanted to stay, and they were given the opportunity to apply for U.S. citizenship within 3 years. However, most still preferred to leave. The purchase agreement expanded the United States by 586,000 square miles, which is twice the size of Texas, and all of this at a very good price. Because Alaska is really huge, you could fit 3 Frances on its territory and 5 Germanys, and exactly 4 Californias. However, since some politicians and journalists thought Alaska was a barren wasteland and were originally against anything President Andrew Johnson supported, it became widely known as Seward's folly. That's because it was William Seward, the U.S. Secretary of State, who negotiated the purchase of Alaska. Actually, most newspapers supported the deal. But the active minority, mostly linked to the radical Republican faction of the Republican Party, relentlessly criticized it. They called Alaska all sorts of derogatory names like Johnson's Polar Bear Garden, Wall Russia, and Russian Fairyland. Horace Greeley, editor of the New York Tribune, led the opposition, writing in particular that most of Alaska was a burden not worth taking as a gift. Some sources say the Americans weren't all that keen on buying Alaska. Edyard Stuckel, the Russian diplomat who set up the deal, had to pour huge amounts of money into bribes for the American politicians and journalists in an attempt to sway public opinion. But if that's true, then the Russian Empire must have had some solid reasons to sell the land, and it seems like they did. Remember I mentioned there were very few permanent residents? Well, what I mean is there were no more than a few hundred Russians living in Alaska at the same time. Far from being self-sufficient, the Russian colony relied on local tribes, the British and Americans for supplies, and of course it also depended on its own supplies. In the end, Russian officials started to worry that American settlers might one day take over Alaska. At the same time, they were afraid of losing their almost defenseless colony to Great Britain, the naval power that had just recently defeated the Russian Empire in the Crimean War of 1853 to 1856, leaving it drowning in debt. And now the fur trade's also on the decline. Even the brother of the Russian emperor himself called Alaska a luxury that the Russian Empire couldn't afford. If any war with the United Kingdom were to happen in the future, it would be hard to defend Alaska. The situation was made worse by the fact that Alaska basically shared a border with the United Kingdom, meaning the possibility of conflict was way too real. So it turned out that the Russian Empire had to choose. Either sell this unprofitable chunk of land or keep it and constantly risk losing it without getting anything in return. The choice seemed pretty obvious. Of course, back then, no one had any idea how valuable Alaska was and how much money it would start bringing very soon. By the way, why was Alaska sold specifically to the U.S.? There weren't really many options. Selling the territory to the British, who still controlled the neighboring Canadian provinces, was out of the question. The United Kingdom was the main colonial rival of the Russian Empire, so anything that could strengthen London's position had to be avoided. At the same time, selling Alaska to the U.S. would have allowed Washington to act as a counterbalance to British influence in the region. Maybe Russian politicians thought that one day the U.S. would conquer all of North America, so why not sell the territory earlier and at least make a little money? So that's how Alaska came under the control of the United States. At this point, most of the land was still unexplored. At first, the U.S. was too busy recovering from the Civil War, and Alaska didn't get much attention. But in 1896, the discovery of gold in the Yukon area of neighboring Canada attracted thousands of miners and new settlers to Alaska, and this put an end to the country's 4-year economic depression. Although it wasn't clear whether there was gold on Alaska itself, the territory, which was already called the District of Alaska at the time, made a huge profit, simply because it was along the easiest transportation route to the Yukon goldfields. Many new towns like Skagway owe their existence to the Canadian gold rush. By 1898, when the best gold fields had already been claimed, many turned their attention to Alaska, and the fact that gold was finally found in 1899 around Nome on the west coast of Alaska drew a lot of prospectors. Between 1897 and 1907, they established over 50 gold mining camps in different parts of Alaska, some of which, like Nome and Fairbanks, turned into major cities. In the early years of the 20th century, they began connecting mines and ports by railroad tracks. Then, between 1915 and 1923, the Alaskan Railroad was created, and Anchorage was founded as its construction base. By this time, Russia's presence in Alaska seemed like a distant past. Although many buildings and religious heritage remained, it's important to note that throughout all this time, the indigenous peoples of Alaska have been living there, regardless of which country claimed Alaska as its own. However, from this chart, you can see how quickly the settlement of Alaska by Americans took off. In 1880, almost no one was eager to settle there. By 1900, the situation had changed. The gold rush had just begun, first in Canada and then in Alaska, and the settlement rate increased to 50 to 60% and then kept growing rapidly. By the way, the fact that people first came to Alaska for prospecting is clear from this chart of the male-to-female ratio. It wasn't until the 2000s that this ratio leveled out. The peak of the male population was in the 1900s, right during the gold rush. This chart shows the population growth of Alaska. In 1880, there were 33,426 people, and by 1900, the population almost doubled, reaching 63,592. After that, there was a period of decline. People left Alaska after the gold rush. The steady, rapid development of the state started in the 1940s and progressed quickly. The population would double or increase by hundreds of thousands every 10 years. What became of the money from selling Alaska? One of the official versions says that the money from the sale of Alaska went towards buying railroad equipment. And this sounds pretty believable because it was around this time that Russia was actively building railroads and there was a severe shortage of materials and equipment. Although some historians claim that Russia didn't get a single cent of that money, as it sank along with the ship Orkney during a storm. But this is most likely not true. A document stored in the Russian State Archive, prepared in the second half of 1868, reports that Russia received 11,362,481 rubles and 94 kopecks in exchange for ceding its territories in North America to the United States. Of this sum, 10,972,238 rubles and 4 kopecks were spent on railway-related expenses. Of course, some of the money landed in the pockets of the people involved in the land deal, but all quite officially. For instance, Edyard Steckel, who I've already mentioned, got a reward of $25,000 and an annual pension of 6,000 rubles per year. Alaska is one of the wealthiest states in the U.S. today, thanks to its abundant natural resources like oil, gold, and fish, as well as vast untouched wilderness in its strategic location. Over the years, whale oil, fur, copper, gold, timber, fish, platinum, zinc, lead, and oil worth hundreds of billions of dollars have been discovered here. All of this has allowed the state to do without a sales tax or income tax and pay every resident an annual stipend. So for the U.S., buying Alaska was definitely worth it. This territory is completely paid for itself, especially considering the price was very low, especially by today's standards. Of course, it's not entirely fair to compare because prices are different now and all that, but I'll go ahead and compare anyway. So Alaska cost the U.S. government twice as much as building a courthouse in New York County. One building compared to an incredibly rich state. It's hard to imagine a better deal. The most important news in the past few days is that I ate some super delicious pizza with persimmon and beef. Indigenous people protest. The U.S. is so proud of its northern state that the country even has a holiday called Alaska Day, which is celebrated on October 18th. In 1867, when Alaska was handed over to the United States, there was a flag-raising ceremony on this day, so the date is quite significant. Parades in honor of Alaska Day usually feature various homemade floats, marching bands, 1860s-era costumes, and an atmosphere of friendliness. However, as is often the case with new developments and land purchases, no one asked indigenous people, and that's why they're against the holiday. They think that the celebration is an approval of the fact that the indigenous people were stripped of their land. Activists argue that the Russian Empire had no right to sell land that didn't belong to it, so the deal with the U.S. was illegal. But who are we to judge? Besides, this happened a long time ago, back in the last century, but the indigenous people don't care how much time has passed, especially since this land was their home for 10,000 years. The indigenous population's also unhappy with what's happening in the state right now. For example, one of the Alaskan tribes got locked in a case about overfishing of herring. The natives claimed that the state was infringing on their rights to subsist on herring roe. The forests are also at risk. The government tried to reinstate the roadless rule in the Tongass National Forest. There are probably many other issues that need clarification, but for now, no one's in a hurry to deal with them. Purchase of Greenland. In case someone didn't know, the U.S. tried to buy Greenland too. It all started a long time ago. In 1814, a treaty was signed that officially put Greenland under Denmark's control, but it turned out that the U.S. also had its eye on this land, and not without reason. There were lots of unexplored areas there. They gave up on it, but every now and then the idea of buying Greenland comes up again. The thing is, since the beginning of the 21st century, which has been quite eventful, Greenland has become an important region for the United States. For example, it's home to a major space facility of the country and lies on the shortest route from the U.S. to Europe. There are also military bases and other facilities there, so the importance of this territory to the United States can't be overestimated. But would Greenland agree to come under U.S. control? Probably not. In 2019, Donald Trump's proposal to buy Greenland, which, by the way, is the largest island in the world, was rejected. The Prime Minister of Denmark, at that time Mette Frederiksen, called the idea absurd, which made Trump cancel his diplomatic visit. Just recently, in 2024, Donald Trump once again stated that Greenland should belong to the United States. According to him, this is in the interest of national security and freedom around the world. The Prime Minister of Greenland, Muda Egede, responded by saying, "Greenland is not for sale and will never be." At the same time, he also pointed out that this territory is always open to cooperation and trade with the rest of the world, especially with its neighbors. A new state. While things aren't going well for the U.S. with Greenland, the country might soon get another chunk of land. I'm talking about Puerto Rico, an archipelago in the Caribbean located about 1,000 miles southeast of Florida. Until the end of the 19th century, Puerto Rico was under Spanish control, after which the archipelago became an unincorporated organized territory. To put it simply, Puerto Rico is governed by the U.S., but it's not part of the country. This special status didn't give the people of Puerto Rico the right to vote in federal elections, and this despite the fact that 3.2 million residents of the archipelago are U.S. citizens. But the situation might change soon. At the end of 2022, the U.S. House of Representatives approved a bill on the status of Puerto Rico, which, if passed, would allow the territory to become one of the states. It also included a mandatory referendum for the residents of Puerto Rico. In the vote, island residents would be able to choose one of three options for the future: joining the U.S. as a state, independence, or becoming a freely associated state, a status similar to what the Marshall Islands and Micronesia have. However, in 2022, the bill didn't pass through the U.S. Senate and was left for a better time. And now, in 2024, that better time has come. The referendum finally took place, and as a result, 57% of Puerto Ricans voted for joining the U.S. as a state, 31% wanted independence, and the remaining 18% voted for Puerto Rico to be a freely associated state. There were some issues, though. The Puerto Rican Independence Party filed a petition asking to stop the referendum, but the U.S. government refused to get involved in the elections and rejected it. In the end, it went as it did. The majority of the population wanted Puerto Rico to become a state. You owe me a like. See you later.